Hey YouTube, Case Against Faith here. As anybody who's ever seen my videos before, you know that I tend to use a lot of sarcasm. Partially because I can be a jerk, and partially because it's entertainment value. I know I'm not the most electrifying speaker, so perhaps throwing in a bit clip from Batman movie or something like that is my way to try to liven up a bit. At any rate, over the last year or two, I've had a number of discussions with a YouTuber who's currently known as TheFunkyTheist. He used to be known as Anglican Apologist, and I usually call him by his first name, David. In my responses to him, I've often used a lot of sarcasm. But despite the fact that I can find his arguments frustrating, I actually think he's basically a good kid. Furthermore, it is true that sometimes sarcasm can get in the way of presenting a message. So to those ends, I will, at least for this particular message and response, I will keep the sarcasm to a minimum. Now here's a review. David did a documentary on the alleged reliability of the Gospel of Mark, which was a 25-minute long video. I did a refutation video series, and it takes longer to refute bad arguments than to state them, so my response was over an hour long. He has chosen to respond to my video series in writing on his blog. Therefore, I also did a written response. It is quite detailed and quite long. Microsoft Word counted it as 25 pages long. But I believe it to be quite strong and hopefully worth the read. I do consider myself a better writer than speaker, and I don't think anybody wants to hear me to read out 25 pages. So what I'm going to do here is just hit some of the highlights and hope it encourages people to read the entire paper. I will include a link to my paper in the underbar. I've actually already taken down the video series, as I believe my new paper does a better job at presenting my arguments and also addresses David's criticisms. So the new paper is both a response to his original documentary and to his rebuttal. In this video here, I will mostly concentrate on a couple of points of his rebuttal, but I will start with a response to an argument raised in his original video that I neglected to address in my previous video series. David provided a quote of Papias relaying information from the so-called presbyter, claiming that Mark was careful to record information accurately from Peter. As near as I can determine, this is David's linchpin for David's umbrella claim of reliability of the entire gospel. As politely as I can be, I can scarcely believe that David finds this to be an argument at all, but it seems to be what he thinks is a very powerful argument. David wants us to believe that everything in the gospel is true because some anonymous first-century Christian says it's true. If I found an anonymous Australian Aborigine to assert that everything in their religion was true, and this Aborigine was reasonably close in time to the origin of the religion, would David find this to be powerful evidence? Somehow I seriously doubt it. David continues to talk about historical accuracy, but this argument more than anything reveals how little David understands. Is there a secular equivalent where a document is given an umbrella of reliability based on some anonymous source relayed by several hands, and that the source and all the hands thereafter are emotionally committed to the agenda that it's a true statement? No, there's not. Or if there is, I'd love to see David demonstrate it. So now on to a couple of topics of David's rebuttal. He responded to my charges of shifting the burden of proof. I will quote some of his defense. Quote, "That's like me saying the burden of proof is shifted when someone asks me for an explanation of the evidence for evolution. Case Against Faith is essentially saying that the whole scientific method is just a way of shifting the burden of proof. But I think most of us like the scientific method, so I think we can all agree that Case Against Faith is just wrong. It is perfectly justified asking for explanations of data that requires explanation." Unquote. To tell the truth, I don't completely follow his claim that I'm essentially slamming the scientific method, so I'm not completely certain if my response will answer his charge. But to clarify, let us say that I'm a proponent of evolution and endeavoring to convince someone else to accept evolution. I would be the claimant and have the burden of proof, but I have at my disposal many resources to meet such a burden of proof. Other people do have the right to say that it doesn't meet their personal evidence threshold. Yes, I'm actually saying that it is 100% legitimate for a creationist to conclude, at least for them, that the evidence for evolution is insufficient. Furthermore, they would be perfectly justified to leave it at that without any explanation whatsoever. Yes, a creationist is free to reject the evidence for evolution without any obligation to anybody to explain why. But now, if the creationist wants me to believe him that evolution is false, that is when he incurs the burden of proof. If he merely rejects the case for evolution and doesn't care what I think, then he has no burden of proof whatsoever. So as to the scientific method, any scientist is free to come up with any hypothesis they like, and free to reject any hypothesis they want. But if the scientist wants anybody else to believe their hypothesis, then they have the burden of proof. But science has methodologies such as experimentation and peer review for scientists to be able to meet such burdens of proof. As I said, I'm not fully getting how he is saying that I'm breaking the scientific method. Perhaps he is saying that I'm making alternative claims and that I want him to believe my alternative claims, and therefore I now have the burden of proof. But that's not the situation at all. The situation is that David has made the claim that the Gospel of Mark is reliable. It is written by John Mark, working from Peter's account. I don't have to prove him wrong. I can simply say that I don't accept his claims, period. I would have no further obligation. And if perchance I give alternate explanations, they need not be exhaustive, they need not be proven. If they are merely plausible, then David the claimant has not made his case. To make his case, that requires that he disprove all alternative hypotheses. Remember, I'm not saying that I know what happened. All I'm saying is that I don't accept his claims, and my alternative hypotheses are just possibilities that I don't claim is what happened. But anytime I offer some alternative hypotheses, he seems to interpret that as a claim that I now have to support. But that's not the case. My alternatives are just to show that there are more choices than David's false dichotomies, etc. One of David's arguments that I find rather silly is that he says that if I say that Papias could have been mistaken, then how Papias came to be mistaken is something that, quote, requires an explanation, unquote. No, it doesn't. People are mistaken all the time. It is a sufficiently common occurrence for people to be mistaken that it is not an event that requires explanation. If David insists on some kind of explanation, I can simply first point out that no matter how smart Papias might have been, he could still only be as accurate as his source. And surely the ever-popular Einstein probably occasionally took the word of a bad source. If David would want even more explanation, then I will suggest yet again to refer to some of Elizabeth Loftus's work on the limitations of memory and eyewitness testimony. I provided some references within my written rebuttal. The fact that humans are fallible is well known and well documented part of the human condition. That is all. The explanation of people being mistaken is all that is necessary. In my video series, I gave, shall I say, an abbreviated rendition of David's arguments in regards to what we may know from Papias, along with a heaping helping of sarcasm. In David's rebuttal, he says that my summation, so to speak, is inaccurate and a distortion of what he argues. So this time I will dispense with the sarcasm and attempt to unpack what he says and show why ultimately my summation is roughly correct. He may well have a complaint about how I presented my summation with all the sarcasm, but the bottom line is it isn't actually terribly far off. Of course, I hope it is understood that my sarcasm was intended to make a point. The point was that David, by using his artistic flourishes of music and graphics and whatnot, made it appear on first glance that he was bringing more to the table than he actually was. He actually brought very little to the table, and that his artistic flourishes didn't change that. So let's politely look at what David actually says. First, David quotes from Papias, where he tells us that he wasn't easily satisfied and asked people questions about what they knew and how they knew it. And this might surprise you, but I'm actually going to concede that this counts for something. There isn't any perfect way to decide whose testimony to believe and whose not to, but one of the ways we make such decisions is whether we think that the person given the testimony gave due diligence to determine whether or not what they said is true. So that Papias is telling us that he used due diligence is of some value. On the other hand, I've yet to meet a person to say, I just believe any crap people tell me. Yes, there does seem to be lots of people that it seems like that's actually the case, but nobody actually believes that about themselves. Everybody thinks they have good discernment and that they use due diligence, at least in regards to their core personal beliefs. So while it is of some value that someone tells us that they use due diligence, we really need more to go on than that to actually believe it. After all, doesn't David realize that the followers of every religion on earth, especially the devout, would likewise tell you that they used due diligence? David tells us that Papias got his information from the presbyters, early church members who are alleged to have been in contact with Jesus' actual disciples. Isn't that obvious that every church to ever exist has had early members who were in contact with the founders of their religion? And is it not also likewise that every church would say great things about their church founders, that they're great men, chosen men on a mission from God, etc., etc.? Does giving them a fancy name like presbyter change the fact that we are just talking about a set of people that we know nothing about other than the fact that they were early members of his church? In other words, they are anonymous. We know essentially nothing about them. So what about Papias? I know that David has read more about Papias than I have, so he can correct me if I'm wrong. But to my understanding, we don't have any information about Papias except for what other church fathers wrote. And we don't have all that much of that. Papias may not be accurately termed completely anonymous, but as far as I know, he's not that far from it. We know little about Papias other than he was an early church father who got some information from some completely unknown early church members. And we wouldn't know that except for the fact that this was preserved by some later, but still fairly early, church member. So pure sarcasm free, that is, at least as far as I know, completely correct, and not really that much different than what I originally said in my video. That's all I'm going to say here. Please read my paper for more complete responses to David's arguments, both his original video and his rebuttal paper. And I've kept the sarcasm to a bare minimum, and I won't conclude here with any Batman or Gene Wilder clips. I think I may use this format a lot for this channel, at least for now. I threw away most of my subscribers when I foolishly closed my old account. I now have very few, and I prefer writing anyway. So I'll probably in the future do things like this right on my website and then post here on YouTube some highlights. Talk to you all later. I hope you read the paper. Bye-bye.